So I'm going to talk about the elastic enterprise and partnership innovation mostly. And I'm going to do that in the context of growing global ecosystems. I'll do it in 3 sections. So I'm going to talk about, put simply, the new enterprise, the new economy, and the new value system around this emerging economy. And what I'll do is stop after each section so to take a question or two, so it's not just me lecturing at you for 40 minutes. No problem if people don't want to ask questions, I can just carry on. So a little bit about me. I began my tech career at the EU in the RACE programme when the EU actually had an industrial policy. So going back to the 1980s, we said Europe really needs something other than trying to compete with the Americans in computing. So let's concentrate on mobile and broadband. And we did it very well, and we became very successful as a continent, if you like. I was also a partner at the Conversation Group, which was the first social agency. And I've tended to do this kind of thing, look at technology, but also the social dimensions of communication. And what I'm going to share with you today are some thoughts from a book that I wrote with Nick Vitellari on the elastic enterprise and new enterprise form. And also some thoughts that I've gathered from talking to a range of CIOs and chief innovation officers around the world. And I want to drive towards a conclusion that they're actually what's changing in business, that we have to migrate away from thinking about wealth creation in terms of the business model and start to think more about the human interest model. And I picked on that partly because, of course, when you look at the analysis of your innovation efforts, the relationship element seems to be about the weakest and the most in need of some effort. So maybe I can provide you with some thoughts around that. Before looking at the new enterprise, though, I just wanted to underline that the old enterprise has been a hugely successful way of creating wealth. If you look at the top 2,000 companies globally, nearly 150 trillion in assets, 36 trillion in revenues, 2.6 trillion in profit. So this old wealth creation system, the one we describe as sclerotic, it can't change, it can't keep up. Well, actually, it still seems to do quite well. But it has hit limits, and those limits are... you can see in something like this where they are now, their shareholder returns are 70% below those of smaller companies. So we know there's something wrong in the way that we scale businesses. And we also know when we look at companies like Pinterest and Facebook that there's an entirely new form of scale out there. So if you look at Pinterest, when it had 50 million members, it still had only 13 employees. And when you look at Facebook, its photo library is now 10,000 times the size of the Library of Congress photo library. So incredible scale at a very low kind of overhead. And I think that's a distinguishing feature. And the reason I have ubiquity networks up there, by the way, is because there is a tendency to think that this new form of scale is all about software and the intangible products around software. But Ubiquity Networks is a Wi-Fi router producer, and I'll come on to them because they have a very interesting model, very interesting ecosystem model for scale. But the distinguishing feature of scale in this model is very low overhead as you scale your business up. And to compare it with what's gone before, I want to set up a very simple, perhaps a naive contrast. The old kind of model that Adam Smith observed 200 years ago, raw materials, capital, labor, and management, IP through management, if you like. And in his particular example, it was all about nail makers. If we can divide a simple task like nail making into many smaller tasks, we can become more specialized, become better, we can reduce the price. If we reduce the price, we grow the market, and there's a virtuous circle. But what we found out over time is, of course, these people need to be supervised. And when you have a cadre of supervisors, you need to have a cadre of managers. And when you have managers, you need to audit and you get regulatory compliance, and then you put more managers on top of them and more managers on top of them. So we've grown this kind of business problem, if you like, through the division of labor. The form in which we decided to scale has the effect of increasing the cost of scale. And that's the problem that big business faces. And typically the way they try to address that is to say, okay, let's begin a change management program. Let's try and create a new culture of nail making. That hardly ever works. Or they say, let's go to the R&D department and find a new way to make nails and drive it into the market through our huge marketing machine. Or they face the nail maker's dilemma, can we make something other than nails that doesn't wreck our nail making business? So I think that, a lot of companies end up in this situation where they're, as it were, waiting on the breakthrough. Is there some kind of breakthrough in this model? But actually all the things that they do to try and innovate are a sad commentary on the state of the model when you compare it to what's coming down the tracks now. So just to summarize, just to give us a point of comparison, that old model well-known, well-understood factor inputs, capital, labour, raw materials, and IP. I think that's a diminishing element of business, obviously, but we need to ask what's coming in its place. So in the Elastic Enterprise, Nick and I spent a year thinking about that, and we said, look, it's something to do with platforms. It's definitely something to do with ecosystems. It's also to do with something called connectors, which I'll explain, cloud and a new form of leadership. I'm going to focus on the first two, platform and ecosystem. But just very, very briefly, connectors would be things like APIs or RSS feeds, where you are automating relationships. You know, in the case of Apple, you automate relationship building with 500,000 developers.
Are these available afterwards?
Sure. Yeah, I'll put them up, yeah. Cloud, cloud platform as a service or software as a service, especially in the cloud, allows you to externalize many core processes, and a form of leadership, which means that you, instead of thinking about raw material, labor, capital, you start to think about partnerships, and you start to think about how can I scale my business through partnerships, and how can I attract the resources that are going to allow me to grow at low overhead. So to focus on platform and ecosystem, I'll start with the ecosystem, and I'll talk a little bit about Forbes.com, where I write. Around the period 2007, 2008, Forbes, like many businesses, particularly media businesses, finally had to face up to the crisis that had been undermining them actually for a decade before that. What was happening was diminishing revenue from their print assets, of course. They acquired a company called TrueSlant, and TrueSlant had a very different type of business model, and I think a very instructive business model as well. What TrueSlant decided to do was say, we will not hire journalists. We're a content company, and we are a media company, but we will outsource, or we will engage with a community of writers around the world that we do not employ. And we don't want their IP either, actually. So Forbes acquired this company, which had effectively outsourced its core. If you think about old media companies, content is absolutely the core of your business. Here you outsource every single element of content production. Forbes decided to take that on and expanded that model, and they attracted 800 writers to practice their art on the Forbes.com platform. And they also encouraged these people to create businesses on that platform. So again, I think a substantial change in the way you regard content. These content producers are no longer regarded as that kind of objective journalistic voice. They have to develop businesses on the platform because they don't get paid enough from Forbes. What it allowed Forbes to do was to attract the audiences of all 800. That's the first thing. So the first ecosystem benefit is 800 writers' audiences. And it also opens up the potential for new lines of business and new revenue streams, because each one of these writers is a business writer and has some kind of alternative revenue that they could scale in relationship with Forbes. So you've basically inverted the model, the content model. And what it did for Forbes initially was double their audience. So within a year, they went from 15 million to 30 million. They're probably around about 33 million unique visitors a month right now. But what also happened was that the click value of a reader subsided. It crashed. So as soon as people started to access websites through mobile, the click cost or the price of advertising diminished something like 90%. So it meant, although they'd grown this audience, they are still wrestling to try and stay in business. But it also meant that they found a core mission for themselves, which is managing real-time ad revenue. And that's a big thing in the media now, never was, but actually trying to, on a daily basis, an hourly basis sometimes, trying to make sure you maximize your ad revenue. Wrong button. Another kind of ecosystem model that I guess people will be familiar with is that contrast between Intel and ARM. So ARM, the chip designer for mobile devices and soon for embedded devices, versus Intel, which dominated the Wintel period, of course. Intel, 54 billion in revenue, 15,000 employees in California alone, ARM, 2,300 employees around the world, and mainly collaborating with other companies. So it collaborates, of course, with companies like Synopsys, which is a semiconductor design tool manufacturer, and it collaborates with universities around the world, particularly with the University of Michigan. In contrast to the 56 billion that Intel has, they turn over only 780 million, and their profit is only 290 million. So there are costs associated with that model. But I think for a long time we thought that here was some kind of secret ingredient. You didn't need to be an Intel, you could be an ARM. But as ARM became established as the model of ecosystem business, along come companies like Ubiquiti, which again is a hardware manufacturer, has 100 employees, the 70th fastest growing company in North America, and about 300 millions in revenue. So if you do the maths, it's something like, is that 3 million per employee compared to ARM, which is 300,000 per employee. I think it's a very impressive form of business, but I think at the same time it tells us something about labour. That labour is becoming increasingly irrelevant to how you scale business. At least employed labour in your organisation. Companies like Ubiquiti saying we don't need it, we can strip it away. We'll boil it all down to the core, and the core is relationship building. So I'll just describe a model of ecosystem business, and I'll use Android's platform business to do that, just to give us some sense of where I think ecosystems are going. Obviously, the Android operating system is a platform that initially Google attracted the Open Handset Alliance, around 48 manufacturers and telecom operators. And these telco operators contributed their developer network, so very quickly what the Android platform was able to do was to create an ecosystem of 50,000 developers around, first of all, the open sourcing of the Android open operating system, and then the apps market. So Google developed the apps market, and these 50,000 started to create apps in competition with Apple and Apple's App Store. There was then, I think, a recognition that actually even this simple model where what you're trying to do is attract developer resources, like Forbes has attracted 800 journalists, Android attracted these 50,000 developers. But actually what's missing is an information layer. And I think this is very critical for Europeans. We neglect information like we neglect marketing. And what you find if you look at what was going on when Android launched its first phone, so going back a couple of years, the G1, at that time there was no launch of any Apple product, certainly no launch of an iPhone product, but the iPhone got 12 times as many references as Android during the G1 launch period. So even a giant like Google could not compete with the information layer that Apple had created around the iPhone. It's changed over time, and that gap was 3-1 the last time I looked at it. But I think if you look at the profitability of Apple and its iPhone and the profitability of most Android handsets, they correlate with the information layer. We can't say the information causes good marketing, good profitability, but it's clear that it goes somewhat hand in hand with it. I think then what we're starting to see in these ecosystem, this kind of classic ecosystem model, platform ecosystem model, is a new hardware layer evolving around the information layer. So you get things like the Pebble Watch, which allows you to read your iPhone data on a wristwatch. And that, by the way, got 88,000 articles written about it within 48 hours of meeting its Kickstarter target. And you're getting Google Glasses. So we're kind of migrating this very software-centric model to a hardware-centric model, and I think gaining the benefit also of the kind of ecosystem that's within the Android and apps community, iPhone community. They're migrating to things like glasses and to the Pebble Watch. So just briefly to talk about the elements of the platform and then the elements of the ecosystem. If you go this kind of platform route, typically you're going to look for a software or content development platform like TrueSlants was for Forbes. You need a developer or production community. You need a lot of elements of this that are hidden to the eye, as it were. So you need to have ways to ingest content into a platform or ingest apps into a platform. You need a transaction engine. I think a kind of hidden element of something like Apple is the huge engineering task of having something like the apps market deliver 1 billion apps in a year without the transaction engine breaking down. And there are different estimates about what that's cost Apple, but the last I heard is they spent about 12 billion on iTunes over the last 5 or so years. You need this information layer, which of course Apple's very good at and Google's getting better at. But I think any company needs it. I think we neglect, as I said, information in Europe. And you need this kind of leadership which says, I want to attract resources. I no longer see my path to scale and growth as my investment. I need to attract the resources of people who want to grow something with me. And I think to do that, you need a new type of leader. You need a very peer-like leader who's respected in their business community. And I think that finally, in the platform era, we're starting to reinvent product around connections and data. In terms of ecosystems, I think, of course, they gather around a platform typically, not always, of course, but they represent very highly scaled partnerships. Again, I don't know that many European companies that are in this game. Of course, you look at companies like Philips that should be, that aren't, although a company like Skype probably is. They're a forum for tens of thousands of developers, and you have this new era of scales where you're looking at billions of calls through the APIs. They would tend to take place in open environments among peers, and you can argue, look, Google never was, Apple never was, Philips still isn't. But I think there is a greater degree of openness in large enterprises now than there was, particularly when they recognize their peer group. They're typically more open with their peers. And they represent new power dynamics, I think, as well, because you cannot market very effectively anymore. Most large companies are finding that old model of, I'll do it in my R&D labs, I'll create the product, and I'll drive it to market with my marketing machine and my PR machine. That game is over. And the information layer is typically built by people like us now. It's built by the customer and the critic, if you like. But I think also critically, it seems to accelerate the pace of innovation. And it does that in relation to a new concept I'll introduce, mass differentiation. They enable companies to produce for global markets, and they enable companies to differentiate their products over and over for global markets. So to give an example of that, the logistics company FedEx recently did an inventory of its mobile apps and found that it actually had 300. And before it did the inventory, it couldn't have told you whether it had more than 5. But around the world, it had, by chance, developed 300 apps. And each one of these apps gives a different flavor to FedEx for a different type of audience in some part of the globe. So we are also seeing, I think, that you can innovate in the external environment without changing your business necessarily all that much. And that you need to do that in global markets, because we have a growing global middle class which has quite different requirements from the old European and American middle class, the declining European and American middle class. So I'll just summarize there, and then I'll stop for a couple of minutes and just see the clarifications that you need. In the old idea, scale via specialization, division of labor, now a kind of scale via partnership and spontaneous peer activity. Scale that was disproportionately more expensive than the gains from it, if you like. Scale that is now proportionally lower in costs compared to the gains. Partnerships that used to be bilaterally negotiated through your lawyers, partnerships which now can be automated through platforms. A command system of leadership versus an attraction system of leadership, which has huge implications for who becomes your leaders. An information layer, which is all about the marketing machine, versus an information layer, which is very self-forming. Mass market versus mass differentiation. And then I think this kind of a subject I'm going to come on to, the fact that a lot of companies in this area are externalizing. They've got the externalization bug. They may start with a platform strategy, but many companies are now looking to see, what do I actually need to employ people for? So I'll stop there just for a sec, just to see. I think, in general, it is a move from an oligopoly type enterprise with power in the market to one where we're much more ecosystem based. But any questions before I move on from that? Yeah.
I have one question for you, Haydn. Thank you. When you say shifting from oligopoly to ecosystem-based businesses, all the actors in the ecosystem, but what about the platforms? The Economist just had an article on this this week, and they think that's why there are investigations about especially Facebook, Google, and Apple, because the platforms make a login for the users that gives them kind of monopoly situation once you're inside the platform.
I think it does. I think that there is a customer acquisition strategy inside there as well. But I think most of those companies are in competition with each other. So leave Yahoo aside, but Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple are competing with each other for those customers, and they share those customers as well. So I'm not quite sure what you're asking about the platform. I think what you have at the moment are 4 companies that can dominate any sector that they move into. So it wouldn't be a surprise to find Google and Apple dominant in TV in 2 years' time. And I think that indicates a new kind of strategy. When you get this highly externalized environment, you have to be much more radical in the adjacency strategies that you adopt. So you can no longer develop your business thinking, I'm going to supply my product to my market. It's what else can I supply to what other markets?
Okay. Oh, the biggest innovation with the iTunes was probably the agreement with music industry. And this didn't happen without negotiation. How do you comment this?
Well, I think iTunes and what Steve Jobs did with Apple in that period, I'll actually come on to it right now, because I think that what people fail to realize about some of these American companies is that they are textbook companies. Apple is a textbook product to service company. It's got a product that it's layered service on. And one of the big challenges for companies through the 90s and the early 2000s is they were told, we all knew we had to get away from a pure product play, and we needed to layer service around our products. But actually what we ended up interpreting that service economy as was things like burger flipping or cleaning services or financial services. So we sort of segmented the economy into product and service, whereas what Apple did very skillfully was combined product and service. Will I go on? So I think the question, I'm going to address that question in some detail now, because a couple of years ago, the Harvard Business Review asked me to analyze their archives. And so they were doing a special edition on failure, and they wanted to understand what goes wrong for companies. And it's a very infrequently asked question in American business, possibly in European business as well. And most business writing tends to be cheerleading. If, however, you start to look at periods of recession and ask, what were people saying about that? Where did people identify accurately what was going wrong for companies? You get a much better feel for some of the issues that you raised about iTunes. In the period, I took 3 recessionary periods, so the only non-recessionary period is 2004, 2006. And what you find if you look at the business literature of 1990-92 is it's all about services. It's trying to get away from that old manufacturing economy, the product economy, to a service layer, not to migrate out of production and manufacturing, but to create a service layer around it. And the criticism of business at the time was we were not creating the service layer. 10 years later, it was actually the same problem. The predominant conversation now was about employees and not being able to get employees to buy into a customer-centric attitude that would enable the service layer. And by 2004 and the boom years, it was about the CEO not being able to exploit this opportunity and what more could we do to make sure CEOs did do that. But you can actually see a kind of crisis running throughout these 15, 20 years, which is, how do we become more service-centric? It was very, very difficult for companies. In 2007, 2010, that conversation stops, and it's all about risk. So if you look at, and this is only the Harvard Business Review, but if you look at all the writing around the Harvard Business Review and its blogs in that period, the predominant concept of failure is risk, and it can be the financial risk because we were in the middle of this financial crisis. It could be China and the risk of competition, low-cost competition. It could be risk brought about by globalization, or it could just be random. The sheer randomness of this new economy was scaring people. And what I think was happening, and what I think is a really useful lesson for people in business at the moment, is that we actually went through 2 transition points. We went through this transition point away from product to service, and we've now gone through another transition point. And I think that is from internally focused concerns to externally focused concerns. And if you look at what's going on 1990 to 2006, it's all about what's going on inside the company. If you look at what people talk about now, it's all about what's happening outside the company. And I think we're gravitating towards externalities. I think the ecosystems are a good example of it. But I think there are many, many cases and many senses in which companies are now looking to, as I said earlier, reduce the employed labour component and partner with people that can provide you with the agility that allows you to compete. And I drew up this list, which I won't go through in any detail, you'll be glad to hear, but I drew up this list, of what companies used to do, how they fared during the service era, and what leading-edge companies are doing at the moment. So if you go back to the industrial era, hierarchical IT, typically built in-house, migrates to a kind of plug-and-play environment during the web era, and now is platform or cloud. And again, the the characteristic of where we're going now is to push things outside the organization and free up the CIO's office to engage much more in business issues. We also saw it in siloed kind of information, so going from silos to knowledge management to open innovation and the ideas economy that grew up over the last 3 or 4 years. And we've seen it in the R&D environment, so we've gone from this kind of closed R&D environment to an open innovation environment. For some reason, my arrows are slightly off there. I don't know why. So I'll move on to look at the kind of things that people externalize at the moment. If you accept that this elastic enterprise is highly externalized, then the way to, not just to scale, but the way to give yourself agility, or the way companies look for agility, is to externalize things they would have previously thought of as core to their business. And I think a very good example of that is in user interface design. So I think the latest Windows UI is externally designed, but UI design used to be really about the character of your company, and it was your window where your customers came into your product base. But it's very, very typical now for companies to externalize UI design because it's so important. And if you think about it, that again is a very, very important change in business. So saying something that's so vital to my business that I need to externalize it is very, very different from the days where we used to say, I need to identify what's core to my business and stick with what's core. And I would say, again, just on that topic, if you speak to younger entrepreneurs, they don't get so hung up on, I've got a core competence that will never change. I'm an engineering company, or I'm in satellite, or whatever I'm in, and I identify precisely what I'm good at within that sphere, and I'm going to stay good at that. Younger entrepreneurs say, no. Right now, we're good at doing collaboration software, but maybe as this market changes, we need to be the best there is at collaborative marketing. And that's where we'll focus all our energies. And they even outsource some of the collaboration stuff. Or you'll see companies, I was talking to the Washington Post a couple of days ago, where they say, when we need to change something, we actually need to change it very quickly. So we know we can't do it internally. Externalizing innovation is actually our best bet of getting something new that we can import into the company and then develop our talent base around. So again, I think it's a different approach to innovation, it's a different approach to partnerships, it's a different approach to agility. I think that what most companies do, though, is they're partly in the industrial area, partly in the service area, and they hesitate to move into these new areas. And just to finally to wrap up that element of what's going on with those 3 different worlds that I talked about, the one that I think is the most important is that when you could run a closed R&D lab and you could drive product into the market, when you felt that was your core, and you had the marketing muscle to do something with that, even as a small company, you will put your marketing resources behind your product. I think that started to die as an idea about 10 or 15 years ago, and larger companies went towards open innovation. Some smaller companies have as well. But I think that all open innovation does, or has done for companies, is to sort of create a cheaper way almost to create variants of your products. I think what really smart companies are doing now is saying, I perhaps don't belong in any one market. And if you're an Apple, you can see that, I don't belong in computing, I belong in mobile. If you're Google, you could even say, I don't belong in search, I belong in automated vehicles. And there's a very real sense in which the next phase of R&D is really about how you deal with this hugely externalized environment and what you become to which customer base in that environment. And traditionally, businesses have had a big problem with that. Whenever a business has tried to take an adjacency move, and for those who don't know what an adjacency is, it's simply, what's next to you. I'm going to move into a market close to mine. You find they struggle, but surprisingly right now, it's companies that take the radical adjacency moves like Amazon into cloud, or Amazon into hardware, or Google into hardware. Making these very radical moves for some reason seems to be both possible and perhaps necessary. So I'll stop there for a minute and just see again any questions around that. Yeah.
Thank you, Haydn. Just the examples that you bring about are, of course, global leaders and have wealth of money to do these kind of shifts. Like, what about other companies and industries. Can you compare a bit on that?
Yes, I think you can see it in other sectors as well. I think Ubiquity Networks is a good example of a company that's decided that it has a movable core. Really, right now its core is relationship building, but you can well imagine that its core becomes marketing, or it could even say, look, my core for the next 5 years is R&D, because I think with the Internet of Things, there's possibly some essence that I can uncover. But I think if you look at companies like McLaren Motoring, the Formula One team, McLaren are now into health diagnostics. So, they do great on-track diagnostics, and they've decided to apply that to health tracking. So as we move towards that the personal data model for health, McLaren are trying to position themselves as leaders there. I don't know how many employees they've got, but it's not Google scale, obviously. But I want to just go on and finally talk about what happens when you look at this externalized environment, what happens to the value system that you bring to business. And I want to argue that actually the business model thinking that we've been obsessed with over the past few years is perhaps less relevant than we think it is, and that what we really need to be thinking about is more of a human interest model and something more about the emotional needs of people right now and what goes into relationship building. It happens to be in business, but I don't think it's only in business. If you look at the language of business at the moment, you no longer see that much talked about raw materials, capital, or labour. What you see are things like social reputation or a sharing economy. We've been talking about ecosystems. You might read about work-life integration or social business or customer ecosystems, of course, or crowdfunding or crowdsourcing or peer networks. We're inventing or developing a language of business which is very, very people-centric, very relationship-centric, and somewhat more emotional than capital, raw materials, labour. And I want to illustrate that with something that might come as a surprise to some people here. It may not. You may already be on top of crowdfunding. But I want to talk just briefly about what I think crowdfunding is going to do to the economy. I think it's catalytic for many of these developments, this externalization of core elements of the business, the importance of relationships in the business as well. If you look back at the VC model, we've all been somewhere near this VC model of business in the past. It's very company-based. To go to a VC, you have to be with a company. You're probably going to compete with 1,000 other companies for every piece of investment, so it's hugely stressful. And you must promise to scale your business. You go into a VC or many funders, and you're not talking about growing incrementally at double-digit growth. You're talking about, can I double, triple? Take a company like Huddle, grew 8-fold last year. It's impossible to get hold of people in Huddle because they're so busy half the time. Compare that with a crowd model of funding. You see things like Kickstarter. There are actually already about 150 crowdfunding platforms in the world. They're project-based sometimes. They don't have to be business-based, and there is no growth requirement in those companies. The assumption of a very high failure rate, which you get with the VC model, which actually stresses most people out, is not there. It's simply absent from the crowdfunding model. There's no assumption of failure, and the outcome burden that you impose is self-imposed. Okay, I want to grow this a little bit. I want to complete this film. I want to write this book. And that makes it very, very entrepreneurial friendly. All those entrepreneurs who cannot be bothered with the banks would not go near a VC or have suffered at the hands of the VCs have an option now to become business people and to fund their businesses through the crowd. It also means, though, that the kind of products that get funded are going to be more culturally orientated, and in a creative economy, at last, there are funding streams for cultural products. In this VC model, it's a very extractive model, so the VC is actually there to exit. Everybody involved is there to get out of it, if you follow the logic. Whereas in a crowdfunding model, it's all about cycling that money back through, building human connections through your funding, and something that these cloud platforms often refer to as extras. So if you invest in the company, you might get the first product off the line, or you might get one of the first 1,000 with your name stamped on it, or if it's a film, you might be invited to walk the red carpet. So it's funding with a human element, if you like, whereas we know that the VC model is not. So I think that, if you go back to what companies like Ubiquity Networks are doing with labour, which is actually eliminating employed labour in favour of partnerships, you can see something changing in capital as well. And I think that everybody in this room underestimates it and thinks, easy for Haydn to say he only writes about these things. We're in business. But I have a global electronics company talking to me at the moment, asking me that question. How do we as a global electronics company utilize crowdfunding? We don't need the money. Well, actually, in some departments we do because we can't access it from our own organization, but we need the engagement with the kinds of audiences that we're serving. So what are we trying to produce? I said at the start that I think we're not talking about a business model. I think that we need to move towards reassessing how we create wealth. It's a new wealth creation system that is not capital dependent or labor dependent necessarily. And we certainly know in many instances it's not raw materials dependent. If you live in a place like Ireland or Spain, you know all about the convergence of incomes globally. In Ireland at a certain point in 2010, 25% of the people had an income level which was about $100, a disposable income after all necessities of about $100, which is just about where a Chinese or Indian person becomes middle class. And if you go to Spain, you go to Greece, and you go to southern Italy and these other places, not in Scandinavia, thankfully, but if you go to most of southern Europe, you'll see that the problem is income convergence with emerging economies. So we're starting to dispense with a large swathe of the European and American middle class. We are growing a global middle class. It's going to be 7 times possibly the scale that it is now. And that's your market. That market is highly differentiated, in fact. It doesn't have Western middle class values. And it tends to have a good enough type approach to innovation and product. So companies like GE will typically produce something like a baby warmer for India at $200 and an incubator for America at $20,000. So it changes the game, and it also changes the game in the way that we've seen with FedEx, that you have to deliver to multiple niches. And I think that what's happening in the background is that, there's so much opposition now to the kind of priorities that global capital has created. This old idea of scale, which just chews people up, or the customer acquisition mentality that we talked about before. That I own you as a customer, I own your data, I bought you. And the streaming of this reward system to a narrower and narrower part of the population. I think those things are losing ground, not just because of the recession. I think they're already losing ground. I think that trust, if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, every year trust in business goes down and down and down. And I think it's because we now witness an unworkable surplus out there. If you look at Apple, if you look at the jobs crisis in Europe and the jobs crisis in America, Apple could solve a lot of that with its 120 billion, but it actually doesn't know what to spend it on. Intel, I'm not sure what their surplus capital is like, but we've reached a situation where companies no longer cycle money back into the economy. And I think that's what's giving us this kind of era. It all seems to come together, like the development of an externalized economy, more pressure on us as individuals to be creative and to create something for ourselves, to create businesses. And I think also new values. And I think crowdfunding is a great example of that, that we don't need those extractive capital surplus values of the past. And we are wrestling with a new post-capitalist value system. It's half-formed, but it's very important. I think we're also in a world now where human capability is our absolute number one priority. Talking to CIOs, their problem is that as soon as somebody leaves a university or a training course, training college, they're already out of date in their skills base. The guys, I probably shouldn't name the company because it's being recorded, but I was talking to a very senior CIO a couple of days ago who said, I need people who can totally reskill every year. I need those people, though, to reskill every week in their job because they're going to be looking at a new application for Twitter or Facebook, or they're going to have Google throwing up some new kind of platform feature that they've got to adapt my business to very quickly. So a sense in which capability for a lot of companies is a serious problem, but also for us as individuals. And I think that we are collectively looking for new experiences that compensate for the kind of income insecurities that may not be a problem in Scandinavia, but I assure you they're a problem everywhere else except for Scandinavia. And I think as well we've got an issue around the kind of emotions that people can experience in their lives, because you talk to people who have a work-life balance problem. There are very many of them. A lot of people are not spending enough time in the home without work. When they go home, it's with their work. When they go to work, they're there too long, and they are frustrated because work is not providing them with enough emotional reward. And I talked again to somebody in a big Australian company recently that said there is no employee satisfaction philosophy in business. It's all about customer satisfaction, but they really don't care about employee satisfaction. So I think we're wrestling with values and emotions and insecurities that we haven't had to wrestle with for a long time. And that's why I think the new economic factors are something like this, that we can create new kinds of platforms where we have participation as developers or content producers or customers. We have developer ecosystems, content production ecosystems, customer ecosystems. We could potentially crowdfund most types of business so we can participate in what's going on in our new wealth creation system as funders. It's likely, like with Lego, that much of the business that we're involved in, we can co-create in some way, even if it's only an Amazon review. And we're very, very likely to be involved in socializing the experience of a product through some form of social media. And most companies are trying to find ways to capture that element. We are co-creating the information layer around products through that process. And I think these all add up to a quite different model of business in the background that companies that really succeed, at least where they are customer-facing, customer being end customer-facing, need to take account of. Or, small companies can actually utilize to grow a different type of company. One example would be Matter. Matter is a Kickstarter project. It's an interesting project. They decided there was room for a new online magazine which addressed serious journalism, which has all but disappeared in the English language, actually, especially online. So companies that have no tradition of, in fact, even those companies that do have a tradition of news production. So it was crowdfunded. It began by building its audience through its funding mechanisms, and it launched its first article only this month. But it's actually delivering what its audience and funders required. And its audience and funders are exactly the same people, by and large. So to summarize, I think we have this new enterprise, the platform and ecosystem approach, which allows us to serve globally differentiated markets. A new economy where we're driving the externalization of key processes and redefining what it means to have a core. We are even redesigning the way capital is utilized or attracted by companies. And I think that we're in the process of defining a new value system, which I think all adds up to a benefit for Nordic culture, because historically I think this is an area that the Nordics have been very well placed to or have actually generated in their own business environment. But I do think, looking at your results, that partnership thinking is the missing link, because in this new externalized economy I think that partnership is actually everything. So
All right. So we have seen from the numbers that we have a hard time struggling getting out of the product focused. So we are not even yet at the services, and now you're coming here telling us to be elastic. So it's a tough message for these guys in the room here after lunch.
I think it's a tough message, but I think the way companies should address it is to work with an external partner on a trial basis. I think if you look what Ericsson is doing, which is obviously a very large company, Ericsson externalizes a lot of its innovation. The Washington Post now externalizes a lot of its innovation. And it does it because existing structures are impervious to change. I mean, they really are. In the end, it's going to take you a decade to get to somewhere that you need to do in 6 months or 3 months. And I think on a pilot basis or a trial basis, to identify a company that's actually 10 times better than you at a particular process or a particular form of invention is very quick, very easy. It needs managing. Of course, needs different management values maybe, but eminently possible.
I talked to Henry Chesborough a few months back, and he said quite good that all the smart people don't work for you, and they never will. They have better things to do. So your approach makes sense in that term.
Yeah, I think there's actually a downside to what Henry's saying there, because you don't want to tell your employees that.
Of course not.
And I don't think it's necessarily true either. I've talked to companies, actually, CIOs and presidents of companies who are trying to internalize more. And what they do is use externalization as a very tactical move. They say, look, right now we don't have somebody that's great at mobile apps, but we really want somebody. So we externalize, and we use that externalization process to train up people internally, because actually what those internal people have that the smart people of the world don't have is loyalty and commitment to a great brand.
Sure. So let's keep it there with a good brand. And I think you will also get a present.
Oh.
Christmas is coming for you as well. And give a big hand to Haydn.
Thanks. Thanks.